Now, to your health, forget patients being identified solely as having type 1 or type 2 diabetes. Experts now say there is actually a variety of intermediate types.
Yeah, and embracing that could mean diagnosing patients much more precisely. That would pave the way for targeted treatment that could help millions of people in the future. Health reporter Haley Hernandez is here to tell us about it.
Yeah, so far, a St. Luke's doctor has identified about a dozen different categories of atypical diabetes. And within each of these categories, there are going to be studies to understand specific metabolic defects.
Dr. Ashok Balasubramanyam is researching why some diabetics don't necessarily fit the box of type 1 and type 2. And what he's discovered is there's not even a type 3 or type 4, but a wide range.
And the way we think of atypical diabetes is as sort of a spectrum. So at one end you have very typical type 1. At the other end, you probably have something that's very typical type 2, but in between there's a whole range of people who seem to have characteristics of both, or who have something totally different in terms of the way they manifest. In other words, patients with type 1 diabetes are generally young and lean and don't have any insulin in their bodies. But what if you're not young and not lean and yet don't have insulin in your bodies? What do you call that, right? So the same thing with people with type 2 diabetes. There are some patients who are very lean and yet they get a kind of type 2 diabetes. How do they fit?
James Swager from the Woodlands was 11 before he ever got a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes.
I would always just feel really weak and faint, and I remember my vision would always get really blurry.
Although he probably should have been diagnosed earlier in life, his disease escalated to the point of hospitalization before he was ever properly treated. And stories like that are common for atypical patients, according to Dr. Balasubramanyam. So to improve identifying when someone has diabetes and potentially pave the way for better treatments, the National Institutes of Health has financed a study called the Rare and Atypical Diabetes Network, or RADIANT, to investigate the causes of numerous unique kinds of diabetes.
So amongst the many patients who've come through for RADIANT, there are quite a few who exactly fit that picture. They look like they have no insulin, they need insulin, they have all sorts of disturbing symptoms, but they don't have those classic antibodies that people associate with autoimmune type 1 diabetes.
Even for adults who try their hardest and live a healthy life and can't manage their diabetes, I mean, I feel like this would help eliminate that stigma and the guilt and the shame that they carry around from a disease that they assume they did to themselves.
I think that's very true, and I think that's particularly true amongst people who fall kind of in the overweight end of the spectrum.
Yeah.
Because if the disease weren't difficult enough to tackle, you now have the added burden of feeling that you did something to yourself and the stigma of the other folks. One of the ways in which I think science really helps people and helps society is to be able to get down to the cause of something. And when you find a cause, you're so relieved that you don't have the mystery surrounding it. You're able to say whether future generations might or might not get it, or they're forewarned if it happens to be genetic, or you find something you can correct that's not simply based on your own behaviors, for instance.
More than 1,000 people with suspected atypical forms of diabetes have applied to participate in this study. If you want to participate, I'm putting that information up on click2houston.com. You'll find the link inside of this article about atypical diabetes. And I'm also going to elaborate on this topic coming up, guys, on the streaming on KPRC2 Plus around 7:45. And I'm going to talk about how things like your genetics and chronic conditions like PCOS, HIV could also mean that you could develop an atypical type of diabetes.
I'm sure your immune system has a big part of it too.
Yeah, it's really fascinating information that they're finding out about this.
Thanks, Haley.
Thank
Can't
you.
wait, 7:45.